We are living in the age of the political avatar, a world of deepfake attack ads, carefully curated TikTok personas, and cable news pundits who analyze a candidate's handshake with the gravity of a national security crisis. It's a permanent performance, where a single gaffe can dominate a week's news cycle, while a 20-page policy proposal vanishes without a trace. You feel at every election cycle, that nagging sense that the contest isn't about ideas anymore. It's about the brand, the optics, the show. This is why we're so exhausted. We're asked to judge leaders based on their digital projection, a carefully constructed image designed to bypass our logic and connect with our gut. A candidate's perceived strength, their likability, their vitality. These have become the metrics of power. Policy substance is secondary, the performance is everything. But how did this happen? When did the political arena transform from a forum of ideas into a television studio? To understand why a politician's social media strategy now seems more critical than their legislative record, you have to go back to a single 90-minute broadcast on a single autumn night. September 26, 1960. The entire system we now take for granted was born in that moment. It was created by accident, through a fatal miscalculation made by one man, Vice President Richard M. Nixon. His decision that night, to treat the first televised presidential debate as a traditional contest of substance, inadvertently proved that a candidate's telegenic confidence could decisively override their arguments in the minds of the electorate. He thought he was in a debate. He was actually in a screen test, and his failure created the playbook for every election to follow. This is the story of how that one night changed everything. It's the story of two men, one who understood the old rules of politics, and one who instinctively grasped the new ones. It's the story of how a piece of furniture in the American living room, the television set, became the most powerful political weapon in history. And it explains why, today, we are all casting votes, not just for a person, but for the avatar they project into our homes. To understand the collision that was about to happen, you must first understand the two men on their way to the stage. They were not just opponents. They represented two entirely different theories of power. Richard Nixon was the statesman. He was a man forged in the crucible of the old system, a world of backroom deals, party loyalty, and substantive, grueling debate. For 8 years, he had been vice president to the most popular man in America, Dwight Eisenhower. He had stared down Khrushchev in Moscow. He had built a reputation on being the smartest, most prepared man in any room. Nixon's core belief was simple: the presidency was a job you earned. His strategy was to present his resume to the American people. He was convinced that his experience, his grasp of foreign policy, and his sheer intellectual weight were the assets that mattered. John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, was the star. He was a creature of a new, emerging political reality. While his resume was impressive, a war hero, a congressman, a senator, yet couldn't compare to Nixon's. Kennedy knew this. So his strategy was a calculated pivot away from experience and towards something more visceral: image. He and his team understood that post-war America was hungry for youth, for glamour, for a vision of the future. His campaign wasn't just about policy. It was about projecting an aura of vitality, confidence, and forward-looking charisma. This created the central, unseen conflict of the 1960 election. Nixon believed the path to the White House was paved with facts and arguments. He was preparing to win a logical contest. Kennedy, however, sensed that a new path was opening up, one that ran directly through the camera lens and into the nation's living rooms. He was preparing to win over an audience. This fundamental difference in strategy is why the first debate became more than a political event. It became an accidental experiment, one that would prove, decisively, which man truly understood the future of power. This clash between the statesman and the star needed a venue, and in 1960, a new one was being built. Because of television, the political battlefield was about to change forever. The idea of a televised presidential debate seems obvious now, but for decades it was impossible. The reason was a well-intentioned rule called Section 315, the Equal Time Law. It basically said that if a network gave one candidate airtime, they had to offer it to asterisk all of them, including every fringe candidate on the ballot. It was a logistical and financial nightmare. So, they just didn't do it. But in 1960, Congress made a consequential decision. They temporarily suspended the rule. This is why the networks, smelling historic ratings, pounced. The man who seized the moment was a young CBS producer named Don Hewitt. Hewitt wasn't a political philosopher. He was a showman. His motivation wasn't to elevate civic discourse. It was to create compelling television. He envisioned a stark, minimalist set. No fancy backdrops, no moderators asking soft questions. Just two men, face to face, under the hot, unforgiving glare of studio lights. What Hewitt and the network executives didn't fully realize was that they weren't simply broadcasting a debate. They were fundamentally changing the nature of political power. For the first time, the entire nation would see the candidates not as disembodied voices on the radio or static photos in a newspaper, but as living, breathing men. They would see them sweat. They would see them stammer. They would judge their posture, their confidence, their fatigue. Because of this new stage, the presidency was no longer just a job application. It was now an audition. This new kind of stage demanded a new kind of preparations. And in the hours leading up to the first debate, on September 26, 1960, both candidates made a series of small, seemingly trivial choices that would have monumental consequences. These choices reveal everything about how each man saw the contest. Kennedy understood he was preparing for a television appearance. Nixon believed he was preparing for a legal argument. This is the decision that created the modern political consultant. Kennedy had spent the weekend campaigning but also resting and meeting with his television advisors in a Chicago hotel. He was tan, relaxed, and focused on presentation. He chose a dark blue suit, knowing it would contrast sharply against the light studio background, making him appear crisp and solid. He was, in essence, studying the medium. Nixon, on the other hand, had been hospitalized just 2 weeks earlier for a serious knee infection. He had lost weight, was in constant pain, and looked sallow and exhausted. He spent the entire day of the debate locked in his hotel room, alone, cramming facts and policy details. Then came the pivotal moment. In the studio, Nixon's team saw how pale he looked under the harsh lights. They offered him professional makeup. Nixon refused. His radio advisor, Ted Rogers, backed him up, seeing no issue. To a man like Nixon, makeup was for actors, a theatrical trick. He believed his substance would shine through the superficials. So he allowed only a light dusting of a drugstore powder called Lazy Shave to cover his famous 5 o'clock shadow. It was a strategically disastrous choice. Because of that refusal, Nixon walked onto Don Hewitt's stage ready to win an argument, while Kennedy arrived ready to win a close-up. Because of that refusal, Nixon walked onto Don Hewitt's stage ready to win an argument, while Kennedy arrived ready to win a close-up. The cameras went live. 70 million Americans tuned in. And for 60 minutes, the nation watched two starkly different performances unfold. On substance, the candidates were evenly matched. Richard Nixon, the seasoned vice president, was a master of policy detail. He parried questions with a barrage of facts and figures, making a strong, logical case for his experience. But television is not a logical medium, it is a visual one. And the visuals were devastating. Kennedy looked directly into the camera, speaking not to the reporters in the room, but to the families in their living rooms. He was calm, confident, and vital. Nixon, by contrast, looked like a man under interrogation. The Lazy Shave powder failed completely under the hot studio lights, melting away to reveal his 5 o'clock shadow. Sweat beaded on his upper lip and forehead. His eyes darted nervously. He looked unwell. The next day, the political world was turned upside down. The initial analysis was a mess. Who had won? The answer, it turned out, depended entirely on how you had consumed the debate. This is the moment that proves the thesis. Pollsters from CBS News discovered something unprecedented. The small audience of radio listeners, who only heard the candidates' words, believed Nixon had won, and won decisively. They heard his command of the facts and his reasoned arguments. But the vast television audience saw a different story. They saw a young, vigorous leader next to a tired, haggard one. For them, Kennedy was the clear winner. For the first time, a candidate's image had not just influenced, but completely inverted the substance of his message. The split-screen verdict was in, and it proved that in the new age of television, you could win the argument and still lose the crowd. This split verdict sent a shockwave through the political establishment. For Richard Nixon's campaign, the realization was horrifying. They had prepared their candidate for a debate, but they had failed to prepare him for a broadcast. They won on the merits but lost on the aesthetics. Because of this strategic failure, a new, urgent question began to dominate every political calculation in America. How will this play on television? Before this moment, campaigns were run by strategists who managed voter blocks, union endorsements, and policy papers. But they knew nothing about lighting grids, camera angles, or makeup. This is why the 1960 debate created an entirely new profession, born out of a single night of televised sweat: the political image maker, the media consultant. The person whose entire job was to manage the visual performance of the candidate. Overnight, the skills of Madison Avenue and Hollywood became essential to winning the White House. No serious candidate could ever again afford to be what Nixon had been. Unprepared for the camera's unforgiving eye, campaigns began hiring television producers, advertising executives, and communications coaches. Their role wasn't to craft policy, it was to craft perceptions. This led directly to the modern campaign apparatus, where the communications director and media consultant hold as much power as the policy director. Every decision, from the color of a tie to the design of a stage backdrop, is now meticulously managed. This is why modern politics is a permanent performance. It's a direct consequence of the lesson learned that night in 1960. The person who wins is no longer just the one with the best arguments, but the one who looks best making them. This new reality, dictated by the unforgiving television camera, fundamentally changed the objective of a political campaign. Because image was now paramount, the very definition of campaigning had to evolve. The goal was no longer to win a drawn-out argument over policy across a dozen stump speeches. The new goal was to win a single, decisive visual moment that could be broadcast into millions of homes. This is why the meticulously staged photo opportunity became the central pillar of modern politics. It wasn't about what a candidate said. It was about what they were seen doing: shaking hands with a soldier, touring a factory, holding a baby. These weren't spontaneous acts of public engagement. They were carefully produced scenes, crafted by the new image makers for the evening news. Every detail, the backdrop, the lighting, the people in the crowd, was designed to communicate a feeling: strength, compassion, patriotism. This shift led directly to the weaponization of the 30-second television ad. Before 1960, political ads were often clumsy, text-heavy affairs that explained a candidate's position. But the new strategists, many hired from Madison Avenue, knew a secret. They knew that an emotional image could bypass logical argument entirely. The most potent example came just 4 years later, in 1964. Lyndon B. Johnson's campaign ran an ad that aired only once but changed everything. It showed a little girl counting daisy petals, her voice suddenly replaced by a nuclear countdown. The screen filled with a mushroom cloud. The message wasn't a policy debate. It was a feeling of pure terror. This was the ultimate lesson of the Kennedy-Nixon debate, distilled into a terrifying poison. In the television age, you didn't need to win the argument. You just needed to win the moment. If the 1960 debate established the principle of visual politics, new technologies would soon turn that principle into a relentless, 24-hour reality. The problem for campaigns was that television's appetite was growing. A single, perfect photo op for the evening news was no longer enough. The game was about to accelerate dramatically. This acceleration began with the birth of 24-hour cable news. Networks like CNN created a constant, insatiable demand for political content. There was no longer an off switch. Every hour of the day became a news hole that needed to be filled, and campaigns had to be the ones to fill it. Because of this, a candidate's life transformed from a series of scheduled performances into one single, unending one. Every handshake in a diner, every off-the-cuff remark on a rope line, was now potential fodder for primetime. The gaffe, a moment of visual or verbal imperfection, became a campaign's greatest fear. And then, the internet arrived, followed by the smartphone. This took the 24/7 news cycle and put it into hyperdrive. The power to broadcast was no longer held by a few networks. It was now in the pocket of every citizen. The stage was no longer a television studio. It was everywhere. This is why modern politics is a permanent performance. Every tweet, every leaked video, every awkward photo is now instantly transmitted and analyzed on a global scale. There are no more private moments for public figures. The discipline required to survive this environment is immense. It's a direct consequence of the world Nixon and Kennedy inadvertently created. That night, one man was judged on a single, televised performance. Today, politicians are judged on a performance that never, ever ends. That night, one man was judged on a single, televised performance. Today, politicians are judged on a performance that never, ever ends. But this raises the ultimate question. Why did that first televised debate have such a seismic, permanent impact? The answer isn't about the technology of television. It's about the psychology of the room it was in. This is the core reason our politics transformed. For all of history, political debate had been a public square affair. You went time to time a rally. You stood in a crowd to hear a speech from a distant stage. The politician was a formal, remote figure, an orator, to be judged on the power of their arguments and the strength of their voice. The entire dynamic was public, and it was loud. But on September 26, 1960, that dynamic was inverted. For the first time in history, the political stage wasn't in a town square. It was inside your home. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon weren't just grainy images on a new device. They were figures, sitting right there, in the corner of your living room. They were, for all intents and purposes, guests. And here is the hidden mechanism that changed everything. We judge a guest in our home by a completely different set of rules than we judge a speaker in a public hall. We don't pull out a scorecard and analyze the logical structure of their arguments. We use a primal, intuitive, social radar. Do I trust this person? Do they seem comfortable in their own skin? Do I like times having them here? This is the subconscious living room test, and John F. Kennedy passed it with flying colors. He was cool, confident, and handsome. He looked like he belonged there. Richard Nixon, sweating under the lights, his eyes darting, his face pale and gaunt, failed catastrophically. He didn't look like a statesman. He looked like an anxious intruder who you wanted to leave. The radio audience, hearing only his arguments, thought Nixon won, but the television audience, applying the living room test, knew Kennedy had. Because of this shift from public square to private home, our entire political system was rewired. Subconscious, emotional judgment was suddenly elevated above conscious, rational analysis. Feeling became more potent than thinking. This is why modern campaigns are obsessed with authenticity and relatability. They aren't just trying to win an argument. They are auditioning, every single night, to be the guest you will allow into your home through your screen. This is the world that was born from Richard Nixon's 5 o'clock shadow. A world where the most important political stage is the few feet between your sofa and your television. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden causes, and leave a comment. Who do you think was the first presidential candidate after Kennedy to truly master the living room test?